Mr. Secretary, I sent you a letter dated March 18th, 2022 with a number of my colleagues. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this letter for the record. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this letter for the record. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this letter for the record.
Without objection. I'm sorry.
Mr. Secretary, we haven't heard back from you yet, a response to this letter dated May 18th. The letter is about the Thrift Savings Plan's investments in Chinese companies that pose a threat to U.S. national security and that use Uyghur slave labor. So in the letter, I note a number of companies that the Thrift Savings Plan invests in that uses Uyghur slave labor. Do you care about human rights abuses of the Uyghur slaves in China?
Yeah, I do, and I don't. My team doesn't remember getting the letter, so I'd like to get a copy of the letter.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
Well, I'm glad you care about it. Are you aware that there are companies that the Thrift Savings Plan invests in that uses Uyghur slave
Not to
labor?
my knowledge.
Okay. How can, Mr. Secretary, how can the United States challenge China while simultaneously allowing investments in the very same companies whose activities threaten the U.S. national security and use forced slave labor in China? How can we accomplish that?
I have no idea.
So you would agree that that's problematic?
Again, I'm going to do some homework on this. We haven't received the letter. If I had the letter on March 21st, and had the information, I'd be unprepared for this question.
Do you believe, Mr. Secretary, that it's in America's best interest to not finance our adversaries?
I certainly believe it's in America's best interest to create more manufacturing opportunities here in the United States of America, supporting the Bipartisan Innovation Act, doing more of the opportunity for investment here in our country is what we should be doing.
But you would agree it's wild that we would allow our federal pension dollars to invest in the military of our biggest adversary.
Again, I'm not familiar with what you're talking about.
But you would agree that would be wild.
I'm not going to speculate on a question.
It's not speculation, it's happening.
Well, I want to make sure it's accurate.
Okay. Clearly, you haven't been paying attention the last few years. In 2020, when the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board plans to, in 2020, it plans to permit investment in Chinese companies. When that first surfaced, the Trump administration directed the FRTIB to halt such investments, citing national security and human rights concerns. So clearly, if you're not aware of this, you weren't paying attention to this in 2020. But Mr. Secretary,
I was the mayor of Boston in 2020.
Yeah.
Wasn't paying attention to a lot the administration was doing at the time.
Hopefully you can catch up on this quickly, Mr. Secretary. This is important. Human rights abuses against Uyghur slaves in China is not a laughing matter.
Yeah, I'm not laughing. I'm well aware of it.
It appears that you're dismissing it, and I want you to pay attention to it. That's why I'm raising it. So can you commit to halting all investment in Chinese companies that abuse human rights in the Thrift Savings Plan?
Again, I have to do some more research on it.
Do you believe that it is in America's best interest to not have our futures invested in and our retirement security dependent on the success of investments in non-market economies and non-democratic countries?
Again, I'm going to do some research on it.
That's not a question that's worth researching. It's a yes or no question.
I just gave you an answer.
Is it worth investing in our adversaries' military through our federal pension program?
Again, I'll do some research on it. I'll get back to you on it.
Mr. Secretary, do you care that there are dollars of federal retirees going toward companies that use Uyghur slave labor in China?
If that's the case, absolutely.
You care about that?
If that's the case, absolutely.
Mr. Secretary, how does your department intend to separate good Chinese companies from bad Chinese companies? What are you doing about that? Like, what would you do about that?
What do you mean by that?
What was what I'm asking you?
Are you talking about American companies in China?
Companies that violate human rights and companies that don't.
Some of the companies that violate human rights are also working for American companies, so we have a bigger issue there.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, I get the impression that you do not care. You do not care that the federal pension program invests in companies that use Uyghur slaves and that you're not intent upon doing anything about it. You've been in this job for long enough that you should know something about it, and you don't. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And I'd like to, if you wouldn't mind sending that letter to my office, because according to my office, we didn't receive the letter. So I'd like to get the letter before I get questioned on something that might not have happened.